For most of the 20th century, this vegetable had a superpower it didn't actually have. A sailor cartoon character ate a can of it and instantly grew forearms like tree trunks, and generations of parents leaned on that image to get their kids to finish their plate. The story everyone tells about why is that some 19th century scientists misplaced a decimal point, accidentally making this vegetable look like it had 10 times the iron it really does. And that error somehow snowballed all the way into a cartoon. It's a great story. Researchers who actually went back and traced the citation trail in the 2010s found no such decimal error ever existed. It's a myth about a myth. What's real and far more interesting than a rounding error is what's actually happening at the molecular level inside this plant. A nitrate compound that your mouth bacteria convert into a molecule your blood vessels use to relax. A carotenoid that physically travels to the back of your eyeball and sits there as a protective pigment. And a mineral-binding acid that means this vegetable's most famous nutrient claim, iron, is mostly a myth for a completely different reason than Popeye. I'm Dr. Dan. This is Molecules Matter, and today we're doing a full deep dive on spinach, where it actually solves real physiological problems, where its reputation outruns the evidence, and exactly how to prepare and pair it to get the most out of every leaf. Welcome back to Molecules Matter with Dr. Dan. Today's food is spinach, Spinacia oleracea, and we've got a lot of ground to cover. We'll trace spinach back to ancient Persia and follow it along trade routes to China and Europe centuries apart. We'll break down the molecules that actually make spinach research-worthy, dietary nitrate and its effect on blood pressure and exercise performance, lutein and zeaxanthin, and their genuinely well-documented role in eye and brain health, and camphorol, a flavanol with anti-inflammatory research behind it. We'll talk about oxalic acid, the molecule responsible for spinach's biggest nutritional asterisk, the one that quietly undercuts both its calcium and its iron claims. We'll look at real randomized trials on spinach, nitrate, and blood pressure, and on a spinach extract that curbed food cravings in a placebo-controlled study. We'll cover who genuinely needs to be careful with spinach, and it's a more specific list than you think. And we'll close with the single most practical adjustment you can make to how you eat this vegetable. Let's get into it. Spinach's origin story centers on ancient Persia, modern-day Iran, where botanists and historians generally place its domestication somewhere around 2,000 years ago, likely bred from a wild ancestor related to Spinacia turkestanica. Some recent genetic research has published the likely domestication zone further east than classical accounts suggested, but the broader Persian and Central Asian region remains a consensus origin point. From there, spinach became a genuine trade route traveler, moving in two directions on two very different timelines. Eastward, written records place spinach arriving in China by 647 AD, reportedly brought from Nepal, early enough that it's sometimes referred to in historical texts as the Persian vegetable. Westward took consistently longer. Muslim traders introduced spinach to Sicily around 827 AD, and the Moors carried it into Spain by the 11th century, from where it spread into the rest of Europe, reaching Germany by the late 1200s. So depending on which direction you look, spinach was a staple in Chinese cooking for centuries before most of Europe had ever seen a leaf of it. Today, the production map is almost comically lopsided. China dominates global spinach production so completely that it accounts for somewhere in the range of 90% or more of the world's total output, dwarfing every other producer combined. The United States sits a distant second, with Turkey, Japan, and Iran rounding out the next tier. But none of them come remotely close to China's scale. It's one of the more extreme production concentrations of any major vegetable crop. Spinach is a genuine cool season crop, and unlike heat-loving vegetables, it actively performs worse as temperatures climb. Optimal growing temperatures sit in the 50 to 60 degree Fahrenheit range. And once daytime temperatures push consistently above 75 degrees, spinach tends to bolt, shifting into flowering and seed production, which turns the leaves bitter and effectively ends the harvest window. On the other end, spinach is remarkably cold hardy once established, tolerating temperatures down into the teens and low 20s. Seeds need soil temperatures of at least 40 degrees to germinate, and the crop is fast. Full-size spinach is typically ready to harvest 45 to 50 days after seeding, while baby spinach, the kind you'll find pre-washed in a clamshell container, can be harvested in as little as 25 to 30 days. That short turnaround is part of why spinach lends itself so well to succession planting, where growers seed new batches every couple of weeks to keep a continuous harvest going through the cool parts of spring and fall. Because of its temperature sensitivity, most commercial spinach is planted for spring and fall harvest windows rather than as a summer crop, which is a big part of why it thrives in temperate growing regions rather than the tropics. A handful of facts that make spinach stand out. First, the Popeye story itself is worth setting straight, because the real history is stranger than the myth. Spinach creator E.C. Sagar actually had Popeye eat spinach for its vitamin A content, not iron. The iron and the decimal point tell wasn't attached to the story until decades later, traced by researchers to a 1972 lecture, and no primary source for an actual misplaced decimal has ever been found. What likely did happen is that an early nutrition reference conflated the iron content of raw spinach with dry spinach, which is naturally far more concentrated once the water is removed. A data mix-up, not a punctuation error. Second, spinach is botanically part of the Amaranthaceae family, making it a relative of beets, quinoa, and Swiss chard, rather than of leafy brassicas like kale, which is technically in the cabbage family. Despite constantly being compared to kale in health articles, the two aren't close botanical relatives at all. Third, spinach comes in more distant forms than most people realize. Smooth leaf spinach, common in prepared and frozen products, savory and semi-savory spinach with crinkled leaves, which is common in farmers markets and in bunches, and baby spinach, which isn't a separate variety so much as any spinach harvested young, before the leaves toughen. Fourth, spinach reshaped an entire industry's safety standards. A 2006 multi-state E. coli outbreak traced to bags of fresh spinach sickened around 200 people across dozens of states, caused several deaths, and led directly to the creation of the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement, which is a set of mandatory food safety practices that now govern how leafy greens are grown and processed in major U.S. production regions. Fifth, spinach is a nutrient density standout among vegetables by almost any composite metric. Its ratio of vitamins and minerals to calories is among the highest of any commonly eaten produce item, which is a big part of why it keeps showing up at the top of healthiest vegetable lists, even though, as we'll get into, some of its headline nutrients don't fully deliver once you account for absorption. Let's talk about the molecular composition and start with macronutrients. Spinach is about as calorically negligible as a food gets, roughly 23 calories per 100 grams, or about 7 calories in a full cup of raw leaves. It's mostly water, with about 3.6 grams of carbohydrate per 100 grams, of which roughly 2.2 grams is fiber, plus around 2.9 grams of protein. Genuinely high for a leafy green, though nowhere near a meaningful protein source in absolute terms, given how little a serving weighs. Fat is essentially zero. The nutritional story here isn't macronutrients at all. It's what's packed into that tiny caloric footprint. Let's talk about micronutrients. This is where spinach earns its reputation, at least on paper. A 100-gram serving, a bit over 3 cups raw, provides roughly 460 to 490 micrograms of vitamin K, which is several times the full daily value in a single serving, making spinach one of the most concentrated dietary sources of vitamin K that exists. It also delivers about 58% of the daily value for vitamin A, around 48% for folate, roughly 30% for manganese, and meaningful amounts of magnesium and potassium. Iron sits at about 45% of the daily value by label numbers, and we're going to spend real time on why that label number is misleading. Vitamin C is comparatively modest at about 28 milligrams per 100 grams, notably lower than in kale. Let's talk about phytonutrients and bioactive compounds. This is the heart of the show, and spinach has a genuinely distinctive phytochemical lineup. Several of its signature compounds aren't just present, they're areas of active, well-designed clinical research. The headline compound in it is dietary nitrate, an inorganic compound spinach accumulates at some of the highest concentrations of any commonly eaten vegetable. Nitrate itself is biologically inert, but bacteria living on the back of your tongue convert dietary nitrate into nitrite, which your body then converts further into nitric oxide, a signaling molecule that relaxes and dilates blood vessels. This pathway, sometimes called the nitrate-nitrite nitric oxide pathway, is a mechanistic backbone for essentially all the cardiovascular and exercise performance research on spinach, and we'll cover the human trial data on it directly. Next are lutein and zeaxanthin, carotenoid pigments. Spinach is one of the richest dietary sources of both, delivering roughly 12 milligrams combined per 100 grams in some analyses. These aren't just antioxidants floating around generically. They're selectively transported to and concentrated into the macula of the retina, where they function as a physical blue light filter and localized antioxidant shield. And they also accumulate in brain tissue, which is a basis for the cognitive research we'll get into. Then there's camphorol, a flavonol structurally related to quercetin, present in spinach in meaningful amounts and studied in laboratory research for anti-inflammatory and antioxidant signaling effects, alongside smaller contributions from quercetin itself. Spinach also contains thylakoids, the internal membrane structures inside chloroplasts where photosynthesis actually happens. This is an unusual one to feature on a nutrition show because thylakoids aren't a classic vitamin or polyphenol. They're a cellular structure. But concentrated thylakoid extracts have become their own specific area of appetite regulation research, which we'll cover in the clinical section. And finally, oxalic acid. Technically an anti-nutrient rather than a beneficial phytonutrient, but it's arguably the single most consequential molecule in this entire episode because it fundamentally changes how much of spinach's mineral content your body actually gets to use. We'll spend real time on this topic too. How cooking and preparation changes the molecules in spinach. This section matters more than spinach for almost every other food we've covered, because raw and cooked spinach are functionally different foods in terms of what your body absorbs. Start with volume and oxalate. Raw spinach is famously voluminous and mild, while cooking collapses it dramatically. A full package of raw spinach reduces to a small handful once wilted, which matters because it means people typically eat a much larger absolute quantity of spinach cooked than raw. Cooking also meaningfully reduces oxalate content. Boiling can cut oxalate by roughly 30 to 87%, depending on cooking time and water volume, largely because oxidate is water-soluble and leaches out into the cooking liquid, while steaming reduces it by a more modest amount, in the range of 30%. The catch is that boiling only removes oxalate from the food if you discard the cooking water. If you're making a soup or braise where you drink the liquid, you haven't removed the oxalate, you've just relocated it. Carotenoid bioavailability is more genuinely contested in the research than you'd expect from how confidently it's often reported. Lutein is bound inside plant cell structures in raw spinach, and cooking, by breaking down cell walls, can help release it. But controlled studies using human intestinal cell models have found the opposite in some conditions. Cellular uptake of lutein was actually greater from uncooked spinach than from cooked spinach across fresh, frozen, and canned samples in at least one well-designed study. While other cooking method comparisons have found that certain techniques, like light boiling or microwaving, can concentrate measurable carotenoid levels. The honest summary is that the raw versus cooked lutein question doesn't have a single clean answer. Cooking time, method, and how you eat it, whole leaf versus blended, all shift the result. And blending raw spinach into a smoothie appears to be one of the more effective ways to physically rupture cell walls and release lutein without the water-soluble losses that come with boiling. One thing that is well established: pairing spinach, cooked or raw, with a source of dietary fat measurably improves absorption of its fat-soluble compounds. Vitamin K, vitamin A, and the carotenoids lutein and zeaxanthin all require dietary fat in order to be absorbed efficiently, since they need to be packaged into micelles alongside fat in the small intestine. A spinach salad with zero added fat is genuinely a worse vehicle for those nutrients than the same spinach with olive oil, cheese, nuts, or avocado. Let's talk about nutrient pairings and absorption. This connects directly to two of the biggest practical takeaways in the whole episode. First, fat pairing, because vitamin K, vitamin A, lutein, and zeaxanthin are all fat-soluble. Spinach cooked in olive oil, tossed with a vinaigrette, or paired with nuts, cheese, or avocado will deliver meaningfully more of these compounds into your bloodstream than the same spinach eaten completely fat-free. Second, and this is a pairing worth remembering, spinach's iron is almost entirely non-heme iron, the plant-based form that's inherently less absorbable than the heme iron found in meat, and its absorption is further suppressed by spinach's own oxalic acid, which binds iron in the gut and blocks a meaningful share of it from ever crossing into your bloodstream. Vitamin C counteracts this directly. Pairing spinach with a vitamin C source like citrus, bell pepper, or tomato converts some of the iron into a more absorbable form and can meaningfully boost how much of it your body actually takes up. If you're eating spinach specifically with iron intake in mind, the vitamin C pairing isn't optional flavor. It's doing real absorption work. Let's talk about human and cellular clinical research on spinach. Let's go compound by compound and be explicit about evidence, strength, because spinach's research base is genuinely strong in some areas and much thinner in others. Starting with dietary nitrate and cardiovascular function, because this is the best human clinical evidence we have for spinach specifically. A randomized controlled crossover trial published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition had healthy adults consume nitrate-rich spinach and found increases in plasma nitric oxide markers alongside improved endothelial function, meaning better blood vessel dilation response compared to a low nitrate control. A separate randomized controlled trial focused specifically on arterial stiffness found that spinach lowered systolic blood pressure and improved flow-mediated dilation, which is a direct measure of blood vessel responsiveness, though it did not produce a significant change in diastolic blood pressure in that trial. Broader reviews pooling multiple nitrate-rich vegetable trials, not limited to spinach alone, consistently show measurable blood pressure reductions tied to plasma nitrate and nitrite increases. On the exercise side, nitrate-rich spinach extracts have been shown in randomized trials to increase exhaled nitric oxide and improve high-intensity exercise tolerance. A more recent systematic review of spinach extract trials found generally favorable, though not universally consistent, effects on physical performance measures. Evidence strength here, well established and mechanistically clear for nitrate's effect on blood pressure and vascular function across multiple randomized trials, with exercise performance effects real but somewhat more variable trial to trial. which is typical for performance research, where individual training status and dosing protocols introduce more noise than a resting blood pressure measurement does. Now, lutein, zeaxanthin, and eye health and brain health. Genuinely one of the more mature research areas in nutrition science, though I want to be precise about which claims come from spinach directly versus from lutein and zeaxanthin as isolated compounds. The landmark ARIDS-2 trial, a large multi-center randomized study, found that supplementing lutein and zeaxanthin reduced progression to advanced age-related macular degeneration by roughly 25% in participants already at elevated risk. That's strong randomized human evidence, though it used supplement dose lutein and zeaxanthin rather than a dietary spinach specifically. On the cognitive side, the Rush Memory and Aging Project, a long-running observational cohort out of Rush University, followed roughly 960 older adults and found that higher intake of green leafy vegetables, spinach predominantly among them, was associated with a slower rate of age-related cognitive decline, with researchers specifically identifying vitamin K, lutein, and folate as the likely nutrients driving that association. That's observational evidence, so it shows a strong and biologically plausible association rather than proof of direct causation. But it's bolstered by the fact that lutein and zeaxanthin are known to physically accumulate in brain tissue, not just the retina, giving the correlation a clear mechanistic backbone. Evidence strength here? Well established for lutein and zeaxanthin's role in eye health via randomized supplement trials, and promising but observational for spinach's specific cognitive benefits. A meaningfully strong association, not yet the same tier of evidence as ARIDS-2. Finally, satiety and appetite. This is a narrower, more novel body of research and centered specifically on concentrated spinach thylakoid extracts rather than spinach as typically eaten. A randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover trial in overweight and obese adults found that a single dose of thylakoid-rich spinach extract increased satiety and reduced hunger and food cravings, including a specifically reduced urge for sweets in women over a 2-hour observation window compared to placebo. The proposed mechanism is that thylakoids slow fat digestion in the gut, which in turn promotes release of satiety hormones. Evidence strength here, promising but early. This is a small number of placebo-controlled trials using a concentrated extract at doses well beyond what you'd get from a normal spinach serving. So it's a real and interesting finding, but not something you should expect a dinner salad to replicate. Who should be cautious? Let's talk about risks and interactions. Spinach is safe and beneficial for the vast majority of people, but there are several genuine, well-documented considerations here. More than for most foods we've covered. First and foremost, significant, kidney stones. Spinach is one of the highest oxalate foods in the typical diet. Some estimates suggest it alone accounts for roughly 40% of total dietary oxalate intake in the U.S., and oxalate stones are the most common type of kidney stones, forming when urinary oxalate concentration crystallizes out of solution. Observational research has found that men and older women who ate spinach 8 or more times a month had a roughly 30% higher risk of developing kidney stones compared to infrequent consumers. If you have a personal history of oxalate kidney stones, this is a genuine evidence-backed reason to moderate spinach intake specifically, not a vague caution. And pairing spinach with a calcium source can help, since calcium binds oxalate in the digestive tract before it's absorbed, reducing the amount that reaches the kidneys. Second, vitamin K and blood thinners. Spinach's vitamin K content is high enough, several times the daily value per serving, that it's one of the foods most likely to interfere with warfarin and similar vitamin K-dependent anticoagulants, since vitamin K directly promotes the clotting factors these medications are designed to suppress. This isn't a reason to avoid spinach if you're on warfarin. It's a reason for consistency. Eating roughly similar amounts of spinach and other vitamin K-rich greens week to week allows your prescriber to calibrate your dose around your actual intake. whereas swinging from none to a lot can throw levels off in either direction. So please talk with your personal medical doctor about this. Third, the calcium and iron absorption issues we've already touched on deserves restating clearly as a caution, not just a pairing tip. Don't rely on spinach as a primary calcium or iron source. Its oxalate content binds a large share of both minerals in the gut, and research comparing calcium absorption specifically found that roughly 5% bioavailability from spinach compared to around 40% from lower oxalate greens like kale, a genuinely large gap, not a rounding difference. Fourth, thyroid function. Spinach does contain goitrogenic compounds, substances that can theoretically interfere with thyroid iodine uptake. But the evidence that normal dietary spinach intake meaningfully affects thyroid function in people with adequate iodine intake is weak. This is a case where the theoretical mechanism gets more attention than the practical risk warrants for most people. It's worth genuine caution only for people with existing thyroid disease and very high raw cruciferous or goitrogenic vegetable intake specifically flagged by their care team. Not a reason for the general population to avoid spinach. Fifth, food safety. Spinach, particularly bagged or pre-washed fresh spinach, has a documented history of E. coli contamination, most notably the 2006 multi-state outbreak. Thorough washing helps but doesn't eliminate risk entirely with leafy greens, and cooked spinach fully eliminates the pathogen risk that raw spinach carries. Worth keeping in mind if you are immunocompromised, pregnant, very young, or otherwise in a higher risk group for foodborne illness. How much should you eat? Given the trial designs we just walked through, roughly 1 to 2 cups of cooked spinach or several cups raw a few times a week is a reasonable, evidence-aligned target for most healthy adults, enough to meaningfully contribute nitrate, lutein, zeaxanthin, and vitamin K without pushing oxalate intake into the range associated with elevated kidney stone risk in the observational research. The stone risk data specifically flagged roughly daily or more consumption 8 or more times a month as the threshold where risk started climbing in susceptible people. So this isn't a food to eat at every single meal if you want to stay well clear of that zone, particularly if you have any personal or family history of kidney stones. For most people without that risk factor, spinach a few times a week, rotated with lower oxalate greens like kale, romaine, or arugula, is a sensible approach that gets you the benefits without concentrating all your leafy green intake into the single highest oxalate option available. Let's talk about organic, variety, and sourcing notes. Spinach's pesticide residue profile is a genuine concern worth knowing about. It is ranked at or near the very top of the Environmental Working Group's Dirty Dozen list in both 2025 and 2026, with more pesticide residue by weight detected than any other produce item tested, including notably high detection rates of permethrin, an insecticide banned for food crop use in the European Union. Given how consistently spinach shows up at the top of that list, it's a more reasonable candidate for buying organic when budget allows, more so than many other vegetables. On variety and form, baby spinach, mature savory spinach, and smooth leaf spinach don't differ dramatically in core nutrient content, though baby spinach tends to be slightly milder and more tender, while mature savory leaves are more nutrient-dense per gram due to lower water content. Frozen spinach is a genuinely strong option nutritionally. It's typically flash frozen shortly after harvest, which preserves nutrients well, and because cooking collapses spinach's volume so dramatically anyway, frozen spinach is often more practical and no less nutritious than buying large quantities of fresh. Canned spinach tends to lose more nutritional ground during processing and often carries added sodium, making it the least favorable of the common foods. Let's talk about myths versus facts. A quick round. Myth: spinach is an exceptional source of usable iron thanks to Popeye. Fact: spinach does not contain a meaningful amount of iron by weight, but its non-heme iron with poor bioavailability is further suppressed by the plant's own oxalic acid. And the decimal point error story explaining spinach's iron reputation has been traced by researchers and found to be false. No such error has ever been documented. Myth: raw spinach is always nutritionally superior to cooked spinach. Fact: it depends on the nutrient. Cooking reduces oxalate content, which can be a genuine benefit. And fat-soluble compounds like vitamin K and carotenoids absorb better with a bit of added fat, regardless of raw or cooked. While lutein bioavailability specifically shows mixed results depending on cooking method and time. Myth: spinach is a great source of dietary calcium because the label shows a decent amount. Fact: its oxalate content blocks a large majority of calcium from actually being absorbed. Real-world bioavailability is closer to 5% versus roughly 40% from lower oxalate greens like kale. How it compares. The most natural comparison for spinach is kale, since the two get lumped together constantly as the healthy leafy greens. But they're not nutritionally interchangeable, and they're not even close botanical relatives. Kale is a brassica, related to broccoli and cabbage, while spinach belongs to the Amaranthia family, alongside beets and chard. Kale contains meaningfully more vitamin C at roughly 93 milligrams per 100 grams compared to spinach's roughly 28, and more usable calcium. Not just higher calcium content on the label, but higher absorbable calcium since kale carries far less oxalate to block it. Spinach, on the other hand, holds a clear edge in folate and in its dietary nitrate content, which is the basis for essentially all the blood pressure and exercise research we've covered. Kale isn't studied nearly as extensively for that pathway. The honest takeaway is that these are two different nutritional tools, rather than one being a strictly better version of the other. Research for kale when calcium and vitamin C absorption matter more, and reach for spinach when you want its nitrate and lutein profile. And ideally rotate between both rather than picking a permanent favorite. Let's now talk about sustainability and environmental footprint. Spinach actually comes out looking quite good on environmental metrics relative to many other vegetables. Its water footprint has been measured at around 132 cubic meters per ton of production. And when weighed against its nutrient density, some analyses rank spinach among the most water-efficient nutrient sources of any crop studied. Its carbon footprint is also comparatively low, driven largely by its fast-growing cycle and efficient land use. Figures in the range of 0.08 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per pound of produce have been reported, notably lower than many other vegetables. The main environmental caveats are regional rather than universal. Heavy pesticide use, tied to the same residue issues that put spinach atop the dirty dozen lists, adds to its footprint. Where conventional intensive farming is used, and in water-stressed growing regions, irrigation demand constrain local groundwater, even though spinach's per-ton water requirement is relatively modest compared to other crops. On balance, spinach is one of the more environmentally efficient vegetables you can buy, particularly when sourced from operations using lower input, less pesticide-intensive practices. Let's talk about the bigger picture. Here's what I want you to take away from all this molecular detail. Spinach earns a real place in a healthy diet, but it earns it for specific, well-documented reasons. Dietary nitrate's effect on blood vessel function and lutein and zeaxanthin's role in eye and likely brain health, not for the reasons pop culture assigned it decades ago. The iron story turned out to be built on a myth about a myth, and the calcium story turns out to be substantially undercut by the plant's own chemistry. That's not a knock on spinach, it's a reminder that a food's actual molecular case can be different from and sometimes more intense and more interesting than its reputation. Spinach's real strengths, and genuinely strong ones, backed by randomized human trials on blood pressure and a large trial on eye disease progression. Its real weaknesses: oxalates, effect on stone risk, and mineral absorption, are also genuinely worth knowing, not glossing over. That's the more complete, more useful picture than either spinach is a miracle food or the iron thing was always fake, so who cares? Let's talk about practical takeaways. 2 concrete actions for this week. First, if you're eating spinach specifically for iron or calcium, pair it deliberately. A squeeze of lemon or a side of bell pepper for iron absorption. And don't count on spinach alone to hit your calcium goals. Lean on lower oxalate sources like kale, yogurt, or fortified foods for that instead. Second, add a source of fat whenever you eat spinach. A drizzle of olive oil, some nuts, a bit of cheese, since that one small change measurably improves how much of its vitamin K, vitamin A, and lutein your body actually absorbs, regardless of whether spinach itself is raw or cooked. That's spinach, a Persian vegetable that crossed the ancient world in two directions, a cartoon-fueled reputation built on a myth nobody can actually source, and underneath all that noise, a genuinely well-studied nitrate and carotenoid profile with real randomized control evidence behind it. If you learned something today, subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone. The molecules matter because you matter. I'm Dr. Dan, and I'll see you on the next episode.